So this is the iPhone X, a landmark phone in the iPhone's lineup. It pioneered the new iPhone design language, the base of which we still have to this day. And honestly, from a personal standpoint, the iPhone X is probably my favorite iPhone ever. However, it was released back in 2017, so it is getting on a bit now. Therefore, I wanted to spend a little bit of time with it, using it as my day-to-day phone to find out whether or not you should still buy the iPhone X in 2022. Alright, so first off, as always, we have the specs. The iPhone X is rocking an Apple A11 Bionic processor, 3GB of RAM, 64 or 256 gigs of internal storage, so a strange selection here by modern standards. However, if 64 gigs isn't enough for you, I mean, it certainly is for me. I have, like 4 apps on my phone. It is nice that you do have the option for a bit more storage. The iPhone X weighs in at 174 grams, which is actually pretty heavy for an iPhone, and it comes in 2 color options, either space gray or silver. Now, I have been a huge fan of the space gray iPhone for years now. I think it's such a nice color, and I haven't really seen it on the iPhone 11 or later. But if you're not a fan of that, there's also silver. And as usual, as for the key specs, that's pretty much it. Now, the iPhone X may look a little bit dated on paper, and we'll certainly be talking more in terms of performance later on. But as usual, I like to keep this section short. You can look this stuff up in like 30 seconds. And honestly, I think we'd all much rather get into real-world performance. So, let's talk about the design and the build quality. The iPhone X still feels really premium to this day, with a glass and stainless steel build that just screams quality. And well, of course, you can now pick this thing up on the used market for like $200. This thing was like $1,000 when it was launched, and that was unheard of at the time, so they kind of had to justify it. It does feel really nice and slick in your hands, and while glass will make this phone more breakable, I've dropped this thing countless times while it was in a case, which for glass phones I always recommend unless you're super careful, and I've never broken one. Also, despite the camera bump being a little bit more dramatic than it is on the newer iPhones, I've never had any issues with that either. The iPhone X also features an IP67 water resistance rating, meaning it can survive in up to a meter of water for 30 minutes, which is nowhere near the 8 meters that we got today. It's a nice failsafe nonetheless. On the iPhone X, we also got the first version of the button layout that we still have today, with the isolated side lock button, separate volume up and down keys, and a mute switch. And in my time using this phone, while I did initially have some issues getting used to it, I've really grown to love this button layout, and using this phone just feels natural. All of the buttons are a nice size, they all feel nice and tactile, though not quite as tactile as aluminium bezeled iPhones in my experience, but still very nice all the same. Overall, the design, the build quality, and the button layout are all stunning on this phone, and it will certainly still get the job done for 2022. Up next, we have the screen, which is super important. The iPhone X features a 5.8-inch, which I still think is the perfect size for a phone screen, 2436 by 1125 OLED display with a PPI of 458 and a peak brightness of 809 nits. It was, of course, the first non-16 by 9 iPhone with that now almost iconic notch design, and even today, I think it still holds up pretty well. As it's OLED, you get deeper blacks, richer contrast, and overall an amazing looking screen. Honestly, using this thing after using the iPhone 13 for several months didn't really feel like that much of a downgrade in my opinion. The iPhone X also features the now standard True Tone, which of course keeps your colors nice and balanced, and for secondary interactions, good old 3D Touch. I've said it before and I'll probably say it again, I really like 3D Touch. I think it's a super cool concept to have a secondary interaction based on pressure, and while I have certainly got used to haptic touch now, cool technology nonetheless. Overall, the screen is what I think really drew me to the iPhone X in the first place, so while it may lack some of the more modern features, what it does do, it does really well. Next up, another first for the iPhone, FaceID. While this technology has certainly come a long way since the iPhone X, with of course angles expanding and the whole process speeding up, I thought that seeing as I've been using newer iPhones for several months, I'd be kind of frustrated to go back to this, but as long as you hold your phone up to your face, it's snappy, it works well in all lighting conditions, and overall, not bad. Okay, so next up, we have the camera, which is a 12 megapixel dual camera system. You got one wide angle with an aperture of f1.8, and of course the telephoto with an aperture of f2.4. Of course, you also do get a front-facing camera, 7 megapixels, f2.2. Nothing particularly mind-blowing there, but how does this actually translate to real-world performance? Well, in terms of photography, I really like the iPhone X. I mentioned a while back that I entirely switched from taking my casual photos with my professional camera to just bringing my phone purely because of the iPhone X. On both the standard and the telephoto lens, colors and dynamic range look good, and there is a nice amount of sharpness, which is always nice. And while you probably would notice the difference putting this thing up against something newer, especially when it comes to more trying situations, I still had a lot of fun taking photos with the iPhone X in 2022. The iPhone X does, of course, also feature portrait mode, which, while only working on the telephoto lens, does actually work pretty well. You get that nice full-frame camera look in your pocket, and while edge detection isn't always perfect, it's still a very nice technology to have. In terms of video, the iPhone X shoots in 4K in up to 60 FPS, which is always good, and while it's certainly not as good as the iPhone 13's video, as long as you get your exposure right, it still looks pretty good. The iPhone X can, of course, also shoot in slow motion, 1080p in up to 240 FPS, and while in video features, the iPhone X is a little bit lacking compared to newer iPhones, I still certainly think that the iPhone X is more than good enough in terms of video features for most people. But what about the front-facing camera? In terms of photos, the iPhone X does take some pretty nice selfies. Again, portrait mode works nicely too, and for some casual selfies, it's certainly good enough. Now, the video recording here does look a little bit dated, with only 1080p and 30 FPS. Yeah, this is kind of a sign of the iPhone X's age here. Honestly, for social media, I think it's fine, and if you want better quality, you can always flip it round. Overall, while there are certainly some signs of the iPhone X's age here, I think for a lot of people, the iPhone X is still more than good enough. Granted, maybe some of those better controls for the portrait mode, or better video and night mode like we saw in the iPhone 11 would have all been nice. I was still very satisfied with the results I got. After this, we have probably the most important aspect of the modern smartphone, OS and app performance. Seeing as the iPhone X was released back in 2017, it's kind of obvious that it's gone through a fair amount of software in its time, but does that make up for the old hardware? Well, in terms of scrolling through the OS, performing system functions, and operating stock apps, the iPhone X still feels pretty phenomenal. Well, of course, if you put this thing next to an iPhone 13, you will probably notice a difference. In my real-world testing, I never had any issues. Now, of course, this is all well and good, but what about more intensive performance? Well, watching 4K videos on this thing, again, I haven't had any issues. I never find the iPhone X stuttering or lacking in any kind of performance, which is nice. Now, in terms of gaming, when it comes to the more intensive stuff, while your phone will be fine 99% of the time, it isn't going to be as fast as the modern offering. So if you're planning to do lots of intensive gaming, maybe the iPhone X isn't the phone for you, but in the Apple Arcade games that I played, totally fine. Now, in terms of support, this thing is getting iOS 16, which is nice to know. So while this is certainly an older iPhone, I can still see this being supported for a decent amount of time. In my opinion, the performance was actually pretty good, and I do still think that this phone has a decent amount of life left in it. Okay, quickly, going back to the hardware, we have these speakers. The iPhone X does have that stereo speaker technology, and while to my ears, they're not as loud as the iPhone 11 or later. That said though, I still find that if I want to chuck on some tunes while I'm in the shower, I never have to connect an external speaker. Finally, and appropriately last, we're going to be talking about the battery life. The iPhone X features a battery size of 2,760 milliamp hours, and this one is a weird one. Seeing as the iPhone X was released at the end of 2017 and then was replaced a year later by the iPhone XS, chances are you're going to buy this thing used. Now, usually that's not an issue. If you get an iPhone X with a new battery or really good battery health, in my usage, I haven't had any problems. But if you buy one with a bad battery, that will not be a good experience. So please, before you buy an iPhone X, check the battery. I've had ones with 100% health, 73% health, and honestly, the difference was all-day battery life, morning battery life. So to summarize, all things considered, I do still really like this phone. Putting aside my personal favoritism here, I think for someone who wants to try out iOS, or if you want to get a phone for a younger relative, or if you just want a well-priced notched iPhone, then honestly, you might want to check out the iPhone 10. Alright guys, so that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Let me know, by the way, what do you think of the iPhone 10? Do you want one? Do you have one? Are you watching this video on one? Feel free to let me know in the comments. I always enjoy reading those. Once again, a huge thank you to anyone who has become a channel member. If you want to get your name in the credits, access to my wallpapers, which you see in these videos, and just to help support the channel, then please do consider becoming a channel member. As for now though, as always, thank you for watching. Remember to like the video if you want to see more content like this, and smash that subscribe button. I'm done for now, and I will see you guys in the next one.